Okay, thank you, Fiona, for the very nice talk. I would like to continue from where you end and point out that I think maybe you are talking about three key concepts. One is ontology, the other is phenomenology, and the third is empirical measures. So in the talk today, I would like to, okay, I would like to divide it into two parts. One is the relationship between ontology, what truly is the essence of conscious experience, and the phenomenology, how the essence manifested at the phenomenal level. And that is what I mean by deconstruct consciousness. Is consciousness intrinsically structured and therefore deconstructible? And then in the second part, I would like to talk about relation between phenomenology and empirical measures. This is what I mean by reconstruct consciousness. Can any empirical measure we can ever develop capture some aspect about the phenomenological structure of conscious experience and therefore reconstruct that? And for the second part, I totally agree with Fiona in the sense that all the empirical measure we get is looking at the relationship between dependent variable and the independent variable. And the independent variable here is essentially the stimuli, the condition we used in the experiment. So whatever relationship we get is going to be constrained by the structure of the stimuli we used in the experiment. Therefore, what we need to do here is try to minimize the confounding influence of the structure of the independent variable we use in the empirical measures. So what we capture as the structure of conscious experience is a true reflection of the intrinsic structure of conscious experience rather than the structure of our measurement procedures. And with the first part, I would like to talk about my personal view of whether our conscious experience is intrinsically structured. To know if it's intrinsically structured, let's first look at whether it is structured at all or not. And to understand that, I would like to invite you to consider the conscious experience you typically have in a cafeteria. There you maybe experience colors, shapes, music, human conversations, calmness, joyfulness. Clearly, these experience can be clustered into different categories, meaning within categories, you feel these experiences are somehow similar, for example, colors and shapes. But between categories, you feel these experiences are distinctly different. For example, between colors and your feeling of joyfulness. The fact that our conscious experience can be categorized, meaning there must be some structured level of phenomenon similarities versus phenomenon distinctiveness. And this structured level of phenomenon similarities and the distinctiveness, to me, is a strong indicator that our conscious experience is structured. And then the next question is whether this structure is merely a reflection of the extrinsic structure of the physical world we are living in. And to illustrate that point, I found this new technique, holographic projection, is quite powerful. So as you can see in the background, it's actually not a real beach, but it is a holographic projection of a beach. If you are interested, I provide the YouTube link here. This holographic projection can create almost or evoke almost identical conscious experience compared to a real physical object. This indicates that even though two stimulation, they are physically distinct, we might be induced the same conscious experience. So the conscious experience is unlikely to be a mere reflection of the extrinsic structure of the physical world. And then we have the third question. So if conscious experience is not a reflection of the extrinsic structure, then is there indeed some intrinsic structure to our conscious experience? And in order to understand that point, I would like you to consider how your conscious experience changes on a daily basis or on a monthly, yearly basis. You will notice that your conscious experience is highly dynamic. It changes, I'm sure, from last minute you have to this current moment, and then it's going to keep on changing. However, despite the dynamic change, we do have a feeling of a sense of continuity, and we can quite easily and intuitively compare how our conscious experience from two different moments they are similar or they are different. And we can even pinpoint what exactly are the similarity and the differences between them. This comparability of conscious experience across different moments, to me, suggests that there must be some intrinsic structure which is independent of the change in the external world. That intrinsic structure is there to individual person's conscious experience. And I would like to use an analogy. The way I think of this intrinsic structure, I would think that is ontology, what truly exists, just like the brain anatomy, which is what underlines all our brain activity patterns. So this intrinsic structure, it underlines our individual conscious experience and the dynamic change in our conscious experience from moment to moment. Just like what I illustrate in this graph here, you have this skeleton intrinsic structure to your consciousness. And then at different moments, depending on the situation you are in, the physical world you are in, your real conscious experience, the phenomenology of your conscious experience may manifest from this essence of conscious experience. With all that said, I still think the difficulty lies in exactly how can we characterize this structure of conscious experience, meaning how can we link ontology to phenomenology. And to characterize that, we need to first define and identify what are the elements of our conscious experience and what are the interrelations between them. And to me, these are the really difficult part. But there may be some way working towards identifying them. One way I can think of is to identify the dimensions that we might intuitively use when we introspect how our conscious experience from different moments, they may be similar or they may be different. These intuitive dimensions may in some way capture or reflect the elements of our conscious experience. And another way is, instead of comparing across different moments, we can also try to introspect and deconstruct individual moment of conscious experience into small phenomenon distinctions. The phenomenon distinction means the part, the content in our experience that we can single out that feel distinctly different from other contents within the same conscious experience. And these could be examples like red or blue, or calmness, joyfulness. These are what I mean by phenomenon distinction, and it is defined officially or very clearly in integrated information theory. So this could be another way to figure out, identify what are the elements of our conscious experience. That said, if we try to do this small exercise, deconstructing our conscious experience and identifying this phenomenon distinction, even just for this very simple conscious experience of you in a forest surrounded by trees with flowers on trees, you might notice that you have countless phenomenon distinction or countless elements. So you will be experience forest, which itself is distinctive from other elements in your conscious experience. You will experience trees, flower, petal, number, texture, area, location, color. The list just goes on. So exactly how do we define what are the elements of our conscious experience? For example, do we only consider the decomposable ones as qualified elements? Or do we also consider the parts that can, or do we only consider the parts that cannot be further decomposed? Or do we also consider the elements that can be further decomposed? And can we ever identify the complete list of potential elements that constitute our conscious experience? And on top of that, how do we identify, define the interrelation between elements? There is a uniform framework clearly define what phenomenologically and ontologically makes sense as the interrelation between elements. This is what integrated information theory is doing. There it defined that as some overlap between these elements in a way that these elements can be integratable. So for example, color and the location are two elements that they have the potential to be integratable to constitute to your object experience. So then you will define there exists some kind of overlap between these elements, and this overlap constitutes as an interrelation between these two elements. But these are ontological definitions, so phenomenologically, how does that interrelation or overlap manifest? Is that some feeling of, I feel these parts are intertwined, that I cannot separate them? Or is that some feeling of phenomenal similarity or distinctiveness, as Fiona, you have also been highlighted, meaning the more interrelated parts, I will find it, the more interrelated elements, I will find that they are phenomenally more similar, and the less they are, I will find they are more phenomenally more distinctive. All of these questions have not been clearly proposed or identified, and I do think what we currently lack is this framework which can link ontology to phenomenology and define exactly what we mean by elements, interrelations, and what we mean by structure of conscious experience. And integrated information has been a really foundational framework along that line, but still there is a lot of work to need to bridge these philosophical framework to our empirical measurements. And with that, I would like to come to the second part, which is how can we measure the structure of conscious experience, and whether what we are measuring is indeed the structure or is a confounded reflection of our measurement. And this part is just the part that I have given in ASSC. So if you have been to my talk in ASSC, I feel a bit sorry for repeating that, but I might want to give a bit more details. So hopefully I can explain all our work, our efforts on the empirical measurement slightly better. And in order to do the measurement, we first acknowledge that our conscious experience is highly multidimensional. Just following the example I gave earlier in the slides, even when you go to a forest, it's a very day-to-day like experience. You will have the experience of trees, flowers, numbers, locations, colors, so the list go on forever. And if we want to reconstruct this multi-dimensional space of conscious experience, can we ever achieve that? So just imagine the current experience you are having. You are clearly not only having visual experience, you are also having auditory experience. But potentially you may also have space, the experience of space, thoughts, emotions, bodily experience. And if we want to measure individual categories of conscious experience we are having right now, and how they are related, as if we are going to take a snapshot of our conscious experience, given the current empirical measurement, I can safely conclude that this is not possible. But this is not to say it is not possible in future. And this is also not to say that we should not work towards that. And in fact, all the work we have been doing is trying to get closer to that. Although our conscious experience is multidimensional, highly complicated, I would like to highlight that our conventional psychophysical measurement is not high dimensional or multifaceted. Just as psychophysics is a typical empirical tool, what it looks is the relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. This is why psychophysics is almost always about the stimuli. In a psychophysics experiment, you may be asked, report the conscious experience of the stimulus shape, size, or color. But whatever you ask, these are of the stimuli. These are along the dimensions of the stimuli. Therefore, what we measure is just the stimulus-related parts, and we totally ignore the stimulus-unrelated aspects of our conscious experience. This means what we may be looking at psychophysics is just the tip of the iceberg, that is the stimulus-related aspects, but the bottom of the iceberg is totally ignored. And that they could be ignored in a way that, let's say two persons, they have identical visual experience for some strange reason, but one person have lots of other contents of conscious experience when they are doing the experiment, psychophysics experiment. They have inner speech, bodily sensation, and the list go on, but the other person have none of that. And if we base on our psychophysics judgment alone, we will say these two persons have identical conscious experience. But clearly, this is not the case. So the vision we have for our 5-year-long project we started in 2019 is to try to develop a way that we can capture the holistic aspect of conscious experience. And it needs to be a quantitative way, as our empirical measures are essentially quantitative. So we want to be able to capture this overall structure of conscious experience, including not just the stimulus-related aspects, but also the stimulus-unrelated aspects. And then we want to look at how this global structure of conscious experience may vary across scenarios, may vary across participants, may vary across states, and hopefully linking the variability in conscious experience to the variability in brain indices, either brain anatomy or brain activity. The difficulty lies in the first part. How can we ever get such a measure? Conceptually, we can say it's quite easy. We just want to capture everything that you are experiencing, and we want to know how these phenomena related to one another. But the reality is, every empirical measure we get is going to be limited by our cognition, and specifically limited by our memory and the language. The inter-individual difference in memory and the language is likely to create a different level of mapping between measurements and the conscious experience. And if we cannot make sure that the mapping between measurement and the conscious experience is consistent across participants, then we cannot infer from the measurements what are truly the variability in conscious experience. Just to give you an example, where 3 people with identical conscious experience can give their measurement, their reports entirely differently. Let's imagine one person who is really good in language. When we ask that person to say, reflect upon what you were experiencing right now, and then report everything in your mind as detailed and as comprehensive as possible, in principle, that person can do that based on their language skills. They have clear vocabulary for individual contents in their conscious experience. But the problem is they are human, so they are limited by memory. They are not computers. So by the time they, let's say, reported the 10th contents, they already forgot the rest 19 contents in their conscious experience. So this person, I used the illustration on the right hand. You can see I use these different pins to illustrate what we can get out of this person's mind. So the final picture we get, the report we get, may just be a random sampling of this person's true conscious experience. And then let's say we have another person who is not so skilled in language per se, but that person has quite a grasp of vocabulary, meaning that person knows vocabulary from different categories. So that person may give you a very broad overview of their conscious experience, but they cannot go into details. And then let's say we have a third person who don't have this broad vocabulary, but who has very long list of vocabulary for an individual aspect of conscious experience. So that person may give you a very detailed report, but that person will lack the coverage. And the problem, as you can see illustrated in my example, is the same phenomenology will be reflected in empirical measurements as entirely different reports. And a person observing from the extrinsic point of view would say these 3 persons must have very different conscious experience, but in reality, these 3 persons may have identical conscious experience. Facing this challenge, what we want to do is, although we cannot make it 100% sure that different people will have identical mapping between the linguistic label and their true conscious experience. But we want to, as the best we can do, align the mapping between the reports and their true conscious experience as much as possible. The way we do that is we choose to go with these broad categories of conscious experience, meaning even if people may not have the same mapping between, let's say, color experience, but we roughly have the same mapping between the linguistic label of visual experience and our true experience per se. It is not like a person might be linking the linguistic label visual experience to a part of experience that another person will label as auditory experience. So in order to minimize the potential misalignment between reports and actual conscious experience, we decided to use a questionnaire way, and then to design a questionnaire to be as easy, as accessible, as unambiguous as possible. And we designed a questionnaire to have 3 parts, one part measuring what people are experiencing, so the content of their experiencing. The other second part measuring the phenomenon character of these contents. The third part measuring phenomenon integration between these contents. If I may use the brain as analogy, what we are trying to capture in part 1 is what are the neurons in the brain. In part 2 is what are the activity of these neurons. So whether one content feel particularly intense, clear, complex, and the other contents may feel less so. And the third part we try to capture is almost like the connection between different neurons. And with these 3 parts, we would like to hopefully get an overview of the global structure of conscious experience. So the exact questionnaire look like this. The first question is quite standard, just ask people to reflect what they were experiencing, and we ask them to tick every content they are experiencing, even if it was very weak and vague. And this is the list we use. And we have been discussing and confirming and testing this list for 2 years, literally. And the list is compiled based on literature as well as on our pilot data set. But during the compilement process, we make sure that the list not only cover what people were given a free report, but also cover the contents that we know are in our conscious experience, but people tend to ignore and tend not to recognize. These are things like experience of space and the time. The reason why people, although they do have the space experience, but they don't tend to report if they use a free report format, is because in free report format, we tend to recognize the contents that is changing. So our visual experience is changing, our auditory experience is changing. And the thing that is changing, we can easily recognize that being part of our conscious experience and then report that. But the thing that is more or less constant, like our overall experience of there is this space surrounding us, are the things that people tend to ignore. So in designing the list, we do make sure that we cover all the theoretical aspects of the contents of our conscious experience. And then in the second part of the questionnaire, we ask people to describe the intensity of individual contents, the complexity and the clarity of individual contents. And these dimensions are selected very carefully. They are not just arbitrarily selected. The way we select these dimensions is we want to know what are the dimensions that appear intuitive to people when they try to introspect exactly how they are experiencing. So we give them the entire list of all the adjectives in English language, and we ask them to identify among the whole list what are the adjectives that can best describe how they are experiencing, and the adjectives related to intensity, complexity, clarity are the most chosen ones. So that's why we decided to go with these 3 dimensions. And in the last part of the questionnaire, we ask people to report how these different contents of their experience feel intertwined. So for example, how do you feel your mixed emotion intertwined with your current visual experience? And the rating was done for each pair of contents. And here I show one example trial from a standard psychophysics experiment. What I want to highlight is the part people report what they are experiencing, the contents they are experiencing when they are doing the trial goes beyond seeing. So they also report planning, problem solving, recalling memory, and all the parts highlighted in color, the contents they report. Conversely, the parts highlighted in color gray are the contents they don't take. They said these are not in their experience. And also they can give a rating in terms of the intensity, complexity, and the clarity of individual contents. They rate, for example, seeing as the most intense, but they don't rate seeing as the most clear. So they actually, this participant actually rated the experience of time as the most clear above among all these contents. So this gives you an overall picture of the measurement. We took really long to design, and then we just apply the measurement across different scenarios, across different individuals, across different states to try to understand the variability in the global structure of conscious experience. And the way we choose to go through a lot of different scenarios, individuals and states is also, like Fiona, you have highlighted, we try to broaden the coverage of independent variable as much as possible and as real life-like as possible. So we not only include the lab settings, but we also include the real life environments, like you walk around the room, you think about how yourself will be like in 10 years or in 1 month or something like that. And the scenarios, although they are broad, they can be broadly categorized into active tasks, meaning people are doing something with actions. So they may do a visual discrimination task where they need to press a button. Passive task, meaning the things people are doing without any action. So they are just passively viewing a visual stimuli. And the no task, like resting state. And we do find there are lots of results, but I would like to highlight 3 results. So one thing we do find is there is a link between the environment or the scenario people are in and the global structure of conscious experience, meaning this global structure of conscious experience is more similar between similar scenarios, like viewing a visual image, which is simple, versus viewing a visual image, which is complex. Then they are between different scenarios, like viewing a visual image and doing a mental rotation task. And the disconnectedness between consciousness and the environment may be something that we can use to diagnose certain people with mental difficulties, like people with schizophrenia. This connectedness we are reporting here is coming from healthy university students. We have not looked into how that may be in certain clinical populations, but we do find that there is a decrease in that connectedness when you are sleep deprived per se. So this is something we think could be of relevance, not just to the consciousness research as a basic research, but also to clinical science. And then the second part we find is the degree to which different people share the global structure of conscious experience is dependent on the scenario. So if the scenario is a very task-oriented scenario, people do tend to report more or less similar global structure of conscious experience. But if this scenario is an intrinsic oriented and inward oriented, like a resting state scenario, people report very different global structure of conscious experience. And we do think this inter-individual similarity in task-oriented scenarios may be the basis for our social collaboration and communication, while the lack of inter-individual similarity in resting state or inward-oriented scenarios may be the basis for our individuality or the intrinsic aspect of conscious experience. And the final result we show is this global structure of conscious experience varies a lot across people, but that variability doesn't correlate with isolated consciousness contents. By isolated consciousness contents, I mean measured using standard psychophysics measurement, things like visual discrimination threshold, things like metacognitive ability, these kind of things. And we also find global structure of conscious experience has higher plasticity than isolated consciousness contents. So these results illustrate that when it comes to consciousness, part cannot represent whole. And hopefully this gives the whole research field some hope that there is indeed something that we can do with empirical measure, although far from perfect, but to hopefully starting looking at the structure aspect of conscious experience. And with that, I would like to thank all the audience and also thank the organizer and also thank NOS for supporting this whole qualia structure initiative. Thank you very much.
Let's have discussion time for like 15 minutes.
All right.
This is working. Okay. Thank you for the talk. While I agree that consciousness is intertwining, I have some skepticism about this approach. So if you go back to the heat map, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to interpret this. So like if you take the time growth, for example, like it's high intensity, medium complexity, and high clarity. Like what exactly does that mean when it comes to time?
Yeah, and there are two parts. So one is exactly what criteria participants use when they give this rating, and then the other, this rating, and the other is theoretically what we try to probe with this rating. And for the first one, this is, I have to say, this is tricky in the sense that different people may interpret the linguistic label intensity, what we mean by that, complexity and clarity differently. But in order to constrain how they link that to their real phenomena experience, this is why we also use things like not just intense, but strong versus weak. So we try to use a set of label to more clearly and ambiguously pinpoint that. But even that, I totally agree with you. We cannot totally confirm that because we are not the participants themselves. As to the second part, what we try to get from the theoretical aspect about intensity and complexity and clarity, we do have some idea in mind. So if we get back to this, maybe just here. So if we just get back to this analogy, what I'm trying to say is, if we take the brain as analogy, the visual experience, let's consider this as some visual regions in the brain. This region may have different level of activity, different magnitude of activity, and what we are trying to get by asking participants to report the intensity is almost like the magnitude aspect of individual content of their conscious experience. And then when it comes to complexity, what we mean is visual experience is a broad category. Within that, you can have color experience and location and the spatial frequency, the list just go on. So the complexity, what we're hoping people to probe is the within category complexity of their experience. And originally, we were theoretically thinking that maybe people would have the highest complexity when it comes to visual experience, because this is the part of experience where we have the longest linguistic categories for. When it comes to emotional experience, we saw people might have not so complex, but actually really people don't go with our theoretical prediction. So some of them actually give quite high complex rating to, for example, emotional experience. This further highlight that the problem with consciousness measure using language. It is possible that language is for extrinsic communication. So that is why it has very detailed category and labeling for things that are physically related, but not for things that are purely mental. So that is with complexity. And what we have with clarity is almost want to measure distinctiveness of individual content. So how distinctiveness visual is to all auditory. So like the phenomenon distinctiveness between these two different categories. So we are hoping that people give a higher rating to clarity is where they can single out that particular categories of their conscious experience from the rest of their conscious experience. So these are what we are theoretically hoping to get.
Thank you very much for the topic. Very exciting and enjoyed very much. So I have a very a point that I want to raise or see what your opinion is that actually in the first half of your talk you mentioned something like conscious experience has intrinsic structure, and you argue you made arguments from the reasoning that okay, different types of stimuli, say picture of the beach and the real beach, can somehow create similar experience to people, and in that sense, we think that there could be there should be intrinsic structure of conscious experience that is independent of the extrinsic work. But my my question is it necessarily to be independent of the extrinsic world? And also, following that question will be view. So in your project, a very good, fascinating project, do you have a premise that, for example, so when you're measuring conscious experience, do you have the premise that the experience of the picture of the beach and the experience of an actual beach are the same? So in your project, when you are trying to measure conscious experience, because well, following up to what you have just answered to that participants in this, so I was wondering, is it, well, in terms of like the distinctiveness of different modality of experiences, have you ever considered to compare the subjective reports of people seeing a picture of the beach and seeing a picture of experiencing the actual beach? Because I doubt that maybe the distinctiveness between, say, visual and auditory experience will be stronger when they just see a picture of the beach, and then when they really experience the beach itself. So that's my question.
Right. These are all excellent questions, and we have in fact been thinking about them. So the first question you ask, I answer, and my answer is, I don't think there necessarily have to be a lack of connectedness between physical world and our conscious experience. And all I'm using that example is just to illustrate the point. But clearly, the degree to which these virtual objects and the real objects can create similar versus distinctive conscious experience is depending on your interaction, the degree to which you interact with the world. So if you are just talking about viewing these from a very long distance, assuming you don't have a super good visual acuity, then for you, they indeed create identical conscious experience. But the moment you try to interact, they will create entirely different conscious experience. So I'm not saying there is, or there has to be a disconnectedness. I'm just saying there can be a disconnectedness to some degree. And this is also what we know in the dreams, for example. And then the second question you are asking is whether when people go with different scenarios in experiments, even if these two scenarios may be identical along a particular dimension, let's say you give people a real picture versus you put them into the beach, whether the measurement, the conscious experience we measure may differ across these, and you are thinking that the conscious experience may be more vivid and more integrated if it's a simulated scenario compared with the real scenario, right? I guess that just means maybe it's because you're from Japan, so the simulation techniques are really good, but sorry. I mean,
the reason is that I'm an reductionist, so I consider conscious experience is constituted by the extrinsic environment. So,
right.
Yeah, that's why I doubt whether there will be differences between seeing a picture,
right.
which is major visual experience, compared to like experiencing the beach itself, which combine visual, auditory, tactile, even, and smell, something like that.
And for that one, we don't have that particular empirical data where we put people in a simulated versus a real scenario. But I think your question points to a more interesting thing, that is how the complexity of our conscious experience relate to the complexity of the external stimulation per se. And you're making the assumption that you think the external stimulation, when it comes to simulated one, they can be more accurate than the real one. But I am kind of doubting that assumption. So we don't have the empirical data here, and I don't think I can provide a theoretical answer to your question either.
Thank you, Amy. Any other thoughts?
Great empirical project. I really like this. And I'm looking forward to see the more detailed results. One thing that again, relating to the other theme of this, today's symposium is about quantum-like nature of the experience. And as you may know, sparring paradigm and other types of the ephemeral kind of experience. There we have quite a strong evidence to suggest that maybe the way you ask people will change the way people report, right? if you ask people to report A first and then B, or if you invite to report C first and then B, then maybe, you know, in one case you can report B, but in other case you may not. So the entire project is very complex. So, you know, I don't think you can do it, you know, in a controlled way, but I guess that probably interesting kind of a broader comparison would be whether your experience or report about extrinsic, you know, phenomenal structure, does it get affected by further asking, you know, intrinsic, you know, aspects of the experience? Because you, as you said, you know, several times, you usually don't care or you don't report about this intrinsic property that doesn't relate to the changing aspect of the simulation, right? So that may completely or may systematically bias your way to report the, you know, changing aspects of our reality, the outside environment.
Yes, and I totally acknowledge all these constraints. So basically, there are two parts. When we ask people to retrospect their conscious experience and then to start reporting, that accuracy of their reports and their real conscious experience is going to decline with the time. Meaning the first question, set of questions we ask is probably going to be most accurate. As it goes on, it's going to be less accurate. In particular, this reflects as if you ask people to tick what are there in their conscious experience, and the order you give the list may reflect the measurement. This is why what we do here is we randomize the order of the items put there. And then this is also why we put this inter-awareness as the third part, how different contents feel intertwined as the third part, knowing that this part is going to take the longest, and is the part, even though it can be measured, it's probably going to be very ambiguous across participants. So we do try to get as comprehensive coverage as possible, but we take into consideration that. And I don't think there's any way to go beyond the limitation of human cognition unless we become a more capable, cognitively capable species somehow at some point. So I agree with that. And then the second point is whether by creating this complicated measurements, we are creating a complexity to our measure, the structure of conscious experience, which probably was not there to begin with. So the measurement we get is imposed by the result we get is imposed by our measurement. And I also don't have a perfect answer to that. All I can say is like I've answered to her. Theoretically, we design all these indices have a clear theoretical correspondence in mind. So these are according to theories and according to literatures, what might indeed be there in the structure of people's conscious experience. And we try to get that. But of course, I cannot disapprove or approve either way, because we don't have a golden reference when we come to consciousness measure. We don't know what it should be. This can differ across people a lot, and there's just no golden standard to compare this.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to stop here because of the time pressure. Thank you again, Professor Chen.